Hello and welcome back to Lean on Success, where process improvement is self-improvement. My name is Ben. I'm a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, and today we're going to talk about why you still can't afford your car. When are we going to be able to afford it? So we're going to look into all of the different variables that are contributing to why cars are so freaking expensive right now. So we're going to walk through this one by one, and we're going to talk a little bit about how this is all the Fed's fault.
Hit the like button and please subscribe so my daddy can get me new toys. Thanks!
All right, so we're going to start with a graph of vehicle sales from 2015 to present. Now, as you can see, the sales rate was holding steady at around 17.7 million from July of 2015 up to the start of the pandemic. Pretty stable. Now, obviously, with the world shutting down, that cut down sales dramatically because people were stuck in their homes. So we see that the first year after the world opened back up, sales rates were a little bit lower, but they were starting to approach the pre-pandemic levels. However, we see starting around the summer of 2021, the sales rate overall started to decline pretty quickly, down to under 15 million. Now, just a quick look at the price index for used cars. You see that once again, prices were holding pretty steady prior to the pandemic, and then they started to spiral completely out of control. Now, this one is a little hard to see, but I basically overlaid the two previous graphs on top of each other, and you can see a very obvious correlation between the increase in sales prices and the decrease in sales volume. Here's a breakdown of the average monthly car payments by credit score. Now, the average payment overall for used cars is $526. And as you can see, for new cars, it's much higher than that. Now, the amount of the average auto loan has also increased pretty dramatically, up almost 6% from a year ago. And as you can see here, the average auto loan rates have also been exploding since the pandemic. Now, obviously, the higher car payments that people are paying now as opposed to a few years ago is in large part due to the fact that cars cost a lot more than they did a few years ago, which we covered in a previous video. But part of that increased car payment is also due to higher interest rates. Now, in a previous video, we talked about how the federal funds rate is the baseline interest rate that banks use to lend money to each other as well as to their customers. We can see prior to the pandemic, the federal funds interest rate was hovering around 2.5%, and then it was dropped down to practically zero as a way to stimulate the economy coming out of the COVID shutdown. As we can see here, starting around the spring of last year, the Fed started to dramatically increase interest rates up to above 5% where they are today. We've also discussed previously the reason why the Fed has dramatically increased interest rates in this way is to fight inflation. Now, inflation got up to nearly 10% last summer, and now it's slowed down to about 5% year over year. Now, what we also covered previously is that our unemployment rate is still at a 70-year low. Here's some breaking news. The debt ceiling that the government's facing might get lifted. It looks like there's an agreement in principle between Congress and the White House to increase the debt limit and to stave off the debt crisis that the U.S. government was about to face. Now, you might say, Ben, what does the Fed and inflation and the debt ceiling and unemployment, what does all of that have to do with used cars? Well, let me break it down. The Fed has been hiking interest rates. They've been on a warpath to get inflation down to a 2% goal. They're not there yet. Inflation currently stands at 5% as of the last CPI report. Now, previously, there's been a lot of pressure put on the Fed by the government to pivot and start lowering interest rates again as a way of avoiding the debt crisis. Additionally, we know that the Fed is very sensitive to unemployment. If they see that unemployment starts to go up, that's going to signal them to stop raising interest rates and to consider lowering them as a way of stabilizing the economy. Now, what we've seen, despite all of these dramatic increases to the federal funds rate, unemployment has stayed historically low, and the U.S. debt crisis is temporarily at least being solved. that's going to be green lights for the Fed to potentially continue to raise interest rates. Now, that's going to get passed down to us in a couple different ways. The first way we're going to experience that is through higher interest charged on auto loans. And here's why. Here's a diagram that's laid out by GM Financial, which is a captive lender for GM dealers. We see that the first step is that the captive lender will originate the contract. This is where the buyer is buying the car in the finance office. The contracts are then bundled and transferred to a shell company as a way of protecting the transaction against potential bankruptcy by the parent company. Because, it's not like GM hasn't recently filed bankruptcy or anything. The shell company then converts those contracts to asset-backed securities. These are then used as collateral to sell corporate bonds to investors. Now, when a company is trying to raise money, one of the things they'll do is to sell bonds to investors. This is basically a request to borrow money from an investor, and they give them a bond, which is basically a promissory note that says, look, if you give me a certain amount of money, I will then pay you a certain amount of interest after a specified period of time. This can be 30 days, 90 days, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, etc. Now, as customers make their monthly payments, that shell company will then use the cash from those buyers to pay out all of these bonds as they mature. So in other words, as these promissory notes start to come due, the interest that is owed to the investors is paid out from the money that is being generated from the monthly payments that the customers are making on their car loans. Now, there's a difference between the amount of interest that the buyer pays, which is higher, and the interest paid to the bond holders when those bonds mature, which is lower. That's considered to be profit that goes back to the original lender, in this case, GM Financial. Now, one of the consequences of all of the quantitative tightening that we've talked about in a previous video is that it has driven up bond prices. So these captive lenders that are selling these corporate bonds, they have to continue to raise their bond prices to stay competitive on the market, because investors are going to buy the higher bonds that pay out higher interest rates. The only way for the captive lenders to be able to continue to pay out those higher bond prices is to charge more interest to the car buyers. So we will continue to see this trend as long as bond prices continue to go up as a result of the Fed sucking all of the money out of the economy as a way of cooling down inflation. So we've covered the first way that the Fed's actions of raising interest rates are directly impacting people who are trying to buy cars. The second way that the Fed is impacting this is through something called floor planning. So it's very similar to a loan that a used car dealer will extend to you to buy a car. The key difference is the interest rates are typically much higher than what you would get charged to buy a car, and the terms are much shorter, typically 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. So the longer that a car dealer is holding on to cars and are unable to sell them, the more interest that compounds on top of that car that they have to pay to the bank that gave them their floor plan. And what we've seen is several banks have either severely reduced the amount of floor planning that they're offering to dealers or exiting the business altogether. The difficulty that dealers are having in keeping up with their payments and maintaining inventory has made the business too risky for these banks to continue doing business this way. In fact, we've seen in the last 2 months, 2 really big subprime car dealers, American Car Center and U.S. Auto Sales, go out of business because they were unable to keep up with the debts and obligations they had, partially from floor planning. So what does this mean for car buying in the near future? What we're seeing is the new car manufacturers are starting to manage their inventory a little bit more closely in order to manage floor plan costs on behalf of their dealers. Now, for used car dealers, particularly independent used car dealers, they can't afford to limit their inventory in order to mitigate their floor plan costs because they have to be able to sell enough cars to stay in business. So they're going to have no choice but to lower their prices in order to keep up with the floor plan interest that they have to pay. Now, additionally, we're also seeing new car inventory start to get back to pre-pandemic levels. And we're also starting to see, for the first time in a long time, some new car dealers are starting to sell cars below their MSRP. So it's starting to become more favorable to be able to buy new cars. For used car market, prices are starting to come down a little bit, but it's still ridiculously much higher than it was a few years ago. In an upcoming video, I'm going to answer the question, when is the best time to buy a car? Did you find any of this interesting? Did I get something terribly wrong? Did I completely bore you to death? Let me know down in the comments. Share this video with your friends. Until next time.